German POWs were amazed by America's industrial might after arriving in the United States. "You prisoners will work hard here, and you'll find no luxuries in America. We're at war, after all. With respect, Sergeant, I think we will find more than you realize." The words came from Hauptmann Werner Schulz, a German Luftwaffe officer who had been shot down over North Africa just 3 months earlier. He stood in the processing center at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on a humid afternoon in July 1943, looking out through the fence at something that made his hands tremble slightly. Beyond the barbed wire, he could see American workers at a nearby factory, and trucks, so many trucks rolling past on the highway. More trucks in 10 minutes than he'd seen in a month back home. The American sergeant, a stern-faced man named Patterson, noticed Werner's gaze and misinterpreted it. "Don't get any ideas about escape, Captain. We've got guards posted every 50 yards. But Werner wasn't thinking about escape. He was thinking about the 5 new automobiles he'd counted in the factory parking lot. Brand new, just sitting there, gleaming in the afternoon sun, while their owners worked inside. Back in Germany, even high-ranking officers couldn't get new cars anymore. Everything went to the war effort. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 6 weeks earlier when Werner Schulz's world had turned upside down. May 12, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. Werner had been flying combat missions for 3 years. He was a seasoned pilot with 17 confirmed kills, a recipient of the Iron Cross, and a true believer in Germany's inevitable victory. That morning, he'd gathered his squadron for their pre-flight briefing in a dusty tent that smelled of aviation fuel and sweat. "Gentlemen," Werner had said, spreading a map across the makeshift table, "today we face another wave of American bombers. They come in their big, lumbering B-17s, thinking their numbers will protect them." He'd smiled then, that confident smile that had inspired his men through dozens of missions. "But we've proven time and again that German engineering and German courage are superior to American mass production. They build quantity, we build quality." His wingman, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, had nodded enthusiastically. Friedrich was 22, bright-eyed and eager. "The Americans are soft, sir. They can't sustain losses like we can. Each pilot we shoot down is irreplaceable to them." But it was the third man in the tent who had voiced the quiet concern that Werner should have heeded. Oberleutnant Hans Bergmann, their squadron's intelligence officer, was older, 35, and had a habit of analyzing reports that others dismissed. "Werner," Hans had said carefully, "I've been reviewing the reconnaissance data. The Americans are bringing in more aircraft than we're shooting down, significantly more, and their pilot training pipeline—" "Hans, my friend," Werner had interrupted, clapping him on the shoulder, "you worry too much. Yes, they have numbers, but what good are numbers when our pilots are better trained, our tactics superior, our resolve stronger? I've read your reports. I know they're producing many aircraft. But production means nothing without quality, without skill, without the warrior spirit." Hans had pressed his lips together and said nothing more. He'd learned that Werner, like many of the senior officers, didn't want to hear analysis that contradicted their beliefs. That afternoon, Werner had led his squadron into what should have been a routine interception. 12 German fighters against a formation of American bombers. The mathematics had seemed straightforward. But something had been different that day. The American fighter escort P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs had been everywhere. Not just numerous, but aggressive, coordinated, relentless. Werner had shot down 1 bomber, but then found himself swarmed by 3 American fighters. His wingman Friedrich had gone down in flames. Another pilot from his squadron had bilayed out. And then Werner's own Messerschmitt had taken hits, the engine coughing black smoke, and he'd barely managed to crash land in the desert before the Americans overran that sector. He'd spent 2 days hiding in a bombed-out building before American infantry found him. They'd been professional, even courteous, as they took him prisoner. That had been the first surprise. The second surprise had come at the temporary POW collection point, a camp of tents surrounded by barbed wire, but clean, organized, with fresh water and adequate food. Werner had expected harsh treatment. Instead, he'd received medical attention for his bruised ribs, 3 meals a day, and even American coffee. "Is this coffee real?" he'd asked the young American private who'd brought it. "Sure is, sir," the private had replied. "We've got plenty, plenty." That word had echoed in Werner's mind. They had plenty of coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture that Germans had been drinking for 2 years. Then had come the journey to America. Werner and 200 other German POWs had been loaded onto a transport ship, the USS General R.L. Howes. The voyage across the Atlantic had taken 11 days, and each day had brought new revelations. The ship itself was enormous, purpose-built for moving troops and prisoners. Werner had learned it was one of dozens of such vessels the Americans had constructed in just the past 2 years. Dozens. Germany's entire merchant marine was a fraction of what America had built recently. The food aboard ship had been another shock. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, bread with real butter, and fruit. Lunch was hot meals with meat. Dinner the same. Werner had lost weight during his months in North Africa, eating rations that grew smaller each week. Now he was gaining it back as a prisoner. "How can they feed us like this?" Friedrich Weber, who'd been captured 2 days after Werner, had whispered one evening. "Don't they need this food for their own soldiers?" Hans Bergman, who'd been captured in the same battle, had answered quietly. "They produce more food than they can eat, Friedrich. I tried to tell Werner, I tried to tell all of you, but no one wanted to hear it." Werner had overheard this and said nothing, because he'd spent the past week watching and learning and beginning to understand just how catastrophically wrong he'd been. Now, standing in the processing center at Camp Shelby, Werner was about to receive his most profound education yet. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. The processing took all afternoon. Werner and his fellow prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, given medical examinations, and issued clean uniforms marked with PW on the back. Everything was systematic, efficient, documented. Werner noticed the American clerks using typewriters, multiple typewriters in one room. Back at his base in Germany, they'd had one typewriter for the entire squadron, and it broke down regularly with no spare parts available to fix it. Sergeant Patterson assigned the German officers to Barracks 7. As they walked across the camp, Werner couldn't help but study everything. The camp had been built recently. He could smell fresh-cut lumber, yet it was complete, spacious, with separate buildings for housing, mess halls, recreation, even a small library and canteen. "How many prisoners are here?" Werner asked Patterson. "This camp holds about 3,000, Patterson replied. "We've got camps like this all across the South. Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, some bigger, some smaller. 3,000 prisoners here, multiple camps." Werner did the mathematics in his head and felt dizzy. "How many German prisoners in America total?" Hans asked. Patterson shrugged. "Don't know exactly. Maybe 100,000 now, more coming every week. 100,000 German POWs in America, being fed, housed, guarded. And the Americans were still sending millions of soldiers overseas, still producing weapons, still feeding their civilian population. The barracks were simple but clean wooden structures with real beds, not cots, mattresses, blankets, electric lights. Werner sat on his assigned bed and ran his hand over the blanket. It was thick, warm, machine-made, mass-produced, like everything else in this country. Friedrich sat on the next bed, looking stunned. "This is nicer than our barracks back home," he said quietly. That evening, Werner got his first look at the camp mess hall, and it changed something fundamental in his understanding of the war. The mess hall was a long wooden building with electric fans, proper tables and benches, and a serving line where American cooks dished out food onto metal trays. Werner had expected prison rations, watery soup, stale bread, perhaps. What he received was a meal better than what he'd eaten as a Luftwaffe officer in the final year before his capture. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, a piece of apple pie for dessert, and milk, fresh, cold milk. Werner sat at a table with Hans and Friedrich staring at his tray. "This is what they feed prisoners," Friedrich whispered. "Prisoners." An older German prisoner, a Wehrmacht sergeant who'd been captured in Sicily, overheard them. His name was Klaus Zimmermann, and he'd been at Camp Shelby for 3 weeks already. "Your new arrivals, yes," Klaus said. "First week is always the same. Everyone's in shock. Wait until you see the canteen." "Canteen?" Werner asked. "Oh yes," Klaus smiled, but it was a sad smile. "We can buy things. They pay us for work 80 cents a day in camp scrip. We can buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even beer once a week. American beer cold from an icebox." Hans leaned forward. "They pay us to work, and we can buy goods. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention very precisely," Klaus explained. "Very precisely. We're treated exactly as it specifies, and they can afford to, you see, because they have so much of everything." He paused, eating a piece of chicken. "Do you know what I realized after 2 weeks here? The guards eat the same food we do. The same food. This isn't special prisoner rations. This is just normal American food." Werner felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked around the mess hall, really looked. 200 German prisoners eating a hot dinner, electric lights overhead. American guards at the doors, relaxed, not tense. Outside through the windows, he could see the setting sun illuminating the camp, the neat rows of barracks, the guard towers with electric spotlights ready to switch on at dark. "How can they afford this?" Werner said, almost to himself. "The expense of guarding us, feeding us, housing us, paying us. Because the expense is nothing to them," Hans replied quietly. "I tried to tell you, Werner. In my intelligence reports, I showed you the American production numbers. You thought they were exaggerated. You thought they were propaganda." Werner set down his fork, no longer hungry despite the food. "Show me. Tell me what you know." Hans pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. The Americans had let him keep it during processing since it contained only his personal observations, no military intelligence. He flipped through pages of neat handwriting. "Before I was captured, I spent 6 months analyzing Allied production data from every source we could find: captured documents, reconnaissance, intelligence reports, even American newspapers and magazines. The Americans don't hide their production figures. They publish them. They want the world to know." He found a page and read. "In 1942, America produced approximately 48,000 aircraft. Germany produced 15,000. In 1943, America will produce over 85,000 aircraft. Germany will produce perhaps 25,000. Friedrich shook his head. "Those numbers can't be accurate. That's impossible." "I thought so too," Hans said. "Why, check them against our own intelligence, against reconnaissance photographs, against pilot reports. Friedrich, every time you shot down an American bomber, how long did it take before you saw that same type of aircraft again?" "Days," Friedrich admitted. "Sometimes the next day. Because they can replace losses faster than we can inflict them," Hans said. "But it's not just aircraft. Look at ships. In 1942, German U-boats sank approximately 8 million tons of Allied shipping." "Do you know how much shipping America built in 1942? Werner waited. 8 million tons, Hans said. "They replaced every ship we sank and built more besides. Their shipyards are producing a new Liberty ship every 42 days. Some shipyards are doing it in 30 days. One ship 10,000 tons in 1 month. Klaus, the older sergeant, nodded. "I've been working in the camp workshop this week. They have tools, good tools, American-made. The sergeant in charge told me these were surplus tools. Surplus. They had too many, so they gave them to the POW camp. When was the last time Germany had surplus anything?" Werner thought about the past year. Shortages of everything, fuel rationed, ammunition rationed, spare parts impossible to find. Pilots flying aircraft held together with salvaged components and hope. "But our equipment is superior," Werner said, though he heard the doubt in his own voice. "The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, they're better than American fighters." "Are they?" Hans asked gently. "Werner, you flew against American fighters. You were shot down by them. Were they inferior?" Werner remembered the P-51 Mustangs that had swarmed his squadron. Fast, maneuverable, with range that let them escort bombers deep into enemy territory. He'd had the advantage of experience, of skill, and it hadn't mattered. There had simply been too many of them, and they'd been good enough. "Even if our aircraft are 10% better," Hans continued, "what does that matter when they have 5 times as many? And their pilots, yes, many are inexperienced, but they're learning, and there are always more of them." The mess hall was growing quiet now. Other German prisoners nearby were listening, drawn into the conversation. These were men who'd fought hard, believed in victory, and now sat in an American prison camp eating better than they had as free soldiers. A young private named Otto spoke up. "I was captured at Kasserine Pass. We thought we'd beaten the Americans badly there. And we did at first, but they came back stronger. They learned from their mistakes. And they had so much equipment, we destroyed their tanks and more tanks appeared. We scattered their infantry and more infantry arrived. It was like fighting the ocean." "They can afford to make mistakes," Hans said. "They can afford to lose battles and learn from them because they have the industrial capacity to replace losses and try again. We can't afford mistakes. Every loss for us is irreplaceable." Werner pushed his tray away, his appetite gone. "Then how can we possibly win?" The question hung in the air. Nobody answered because they all knew the answer now. They just weren't ready to say it aloud yet. That night, Werner lay in his bed in Barracks 7, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down. Electric lights switching off. Guards making their rounds. In the distance, he heard a train whistle, a freight train, he learned later, carrying goods to some factory or depot. The trains ran all night here, carrying raw materials, finished products, food, equipment. The American industrial machine never slept. He thought about Germany, about his wife, Anna, in Berlin. About his 2 children. Heinrich was 8 now, little Maria was 5. What were they eating tonight? Were they safe? The Allied bombing raids on German cities had intensified. Hans had told him before the mission that day, the day he was shot down, that Cologne had been devastated by a 1,000-bomber raid. 1,000 bombers in a single raid. Werner had thought it was an exaggeration. Now he knew better. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Werner dreamed of endless factories, production lines stretching to the horizon, churning out aircraft and tanks and ships faster than they could be counted. The next morning, Werner and the other new arrivals were assigned to work details. The Geneva Convention required that POWs work, but not on anything directly related to the war effort. The Americans put them to work on farms, in forestry, in maintenance and construction of non-military facilities. Werner was assigned to a work detail at a nearby cotton farm, along with 20 other German prisoners. An American Army truck picked them up at dawn and drove them 15 miles into the Mississippi countryside. The truck itself was another revelation. It was brand new, a GMC six-wheeler, running smoothly on good tires, burning gasoline without any hesitation or sputtering. In Germany, military vehicles were patched together, running on synthetic fuel that fouled engines, often breaking down. This American truck was just one of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, and it worked perfectly. The farm they arrived at was run by a family named Harrison. John Harrison was in his 50s, weathered and practical. His son was in the army, fighting in Italy, which gave the whole situation a strange irony, German prisoners working on the farm while his American son fought Germans overseas. "You'll be picking cotton," Harrison explained through a translator, a German-American sergeant named Fisher. "It's hard work, but honest work. You'll get breaks, water, and lunch. Any questions?" Werner looked at the cotton fields stretching away under the morning sun. He'd never picked cotton before. In Germany, he'd been an engineering student before the war, then a pilot, an officer. Manual farm labor was beneath his social class. But he was a prisoner now, and pride seemed like a luxury he could no longer afford. "No questions," Werner said. They worked through the morning, dragging heavy canvas bags between the rows, pulling cotton bolls and stuffing them in the bags. The sun grew hot. Werner's back ached. His hands, used to control sticks and throttles, cramped from the unfamiliar work. But during the breaks, he watched and learned. Harrison's farm had 3 tractors. 3. They sat in a barn that was better maintained than some Luftwaffe hangar facilities Werner had seen. The tractors were international harvesters, painted red, maintained regularly with spare parts stored on shelves. Spare parts. In Germany, a farmer would be lucky to have 1 tractor, and it would be old, held together with improvised repairs, running on rationed fuel. At lunchtime, Harrison's wife brought food to the field, sandwiches with meat and cheese, apples, cold water from an icebox. The Harrisons ate the same food as their workers. It was simply how much food was available here. "Mr. Harrison," Werner asked through Sergeant Fisher, "your son is a soldier. Do you hate us for that?" Harrison looked at him for a long moment. "I don't hate you, son. You're doing your duty same as my boy's doing his. I hate the war. I hate what it's doing to everybody. But I don't hate you personally." "We are the enemy," Werner said. "You were the enemy," Harrison corrected. "Now you're prisoners working on my farm, and I treat you fair. When this war's over, you'll go home to your families. My son will come home to his family, and maybe we'll all be wise enough not to do this again." It was a simple philosophy, and it struck Werner as profoundly American, practical, forward-looking, focused on work and family rather than ideology and glory. At afternoon, a remarkable thing happened. Harrison's truck, the one they used for transporting cotton bales, broke down. The engine overheated and steam poured from the radiator. "Damn," Harrison muttered. "That's going to cost me half a day while I fix it." Werner had been a pilot, but he'd also been an engineering student. He understood engines. "I might be able to help," he said through Fisher. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "You know trucks." "I know engines. All engines work on the same principles." Harrison considered this, then shrugged. "All right, can't hurt to look." Werner opened the hood and studied the engine. It was beautifully made precision parts, clearly manufactured to exact specifications. The problem was obvious. A split rubber hose had leaked all the coolant. A simple fix, but it needed a new hose. "You need a replacement hose," Werner said. "Here, this one," he pointed. Harrison nodded. "I've got spare hoses in the barn. Come on." Werner followed him to the barn, and what he saw there made him stop in his tracks. An entire wall of the barn was dedicated to spare parts, carefully organized on shelves. Hoses, belts, filters, spark plugs, gaskets, tools, everything labeled, everything accessible. "You keep all these spares?" Werner asked. "Sure," Harrison said. "Can't afford to have equipment down during harvest. I order parts from the catalog, keep them on hand. Most farmers do." Werner picked up a spark plug, examined it. It was made by Champion, mass-produced to exact specifications, and it cost, he saw the label, 25 cents. In Germany, such a spark plug would be worth its weight in silver if you could find one at all. Mr. Harrison, Werner said slowly, in Germany we are rationed. Fuel, food, clothing, everything. We are told that sacrifices are necessary for the war effort. We are told that Germany is strong, that our economy is robust, that we are fighting with efficiency and purpose. Harrison handed him the new hose. And here I am, a prisoner in your country, looking at a barn full of spare parts that you keep just in case. Your wife feeds us meat and cheese, your trucks work perfectly, you have 3 tractors, 3, and you're just one farmer among millions. Werner felt something breaking inside him, some last fortress of belief crumbling. We were lied to. All of us, we were told America was weak, decadent, that you couldn't fight a sustained war. But you have so much of everything. And you're not even trying your hardest yet, are you? Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, son, America's got over 100 million people who have never known real hunger, never known real want. We've got factories that make more goods than we can use. We've got farms that grow more food than we can eat. Could we do better? Sure. But we've got capacity, that's the word. Capacity. We can make mistakes and recover. We can lose battles and come back. We can feed our enemies while fighting them. He paused. Your country picked a fight with that. You think about what that means. Werner installed the new hose and Harrison drove them back to camp that evening. Werner sat in the back of the truck with the other prisoners, watching the American countryside roll past. Small towns, each with electric lights. Cars parked on streets. Shops open, people walking around freely. This was a country at war, but you could barely tell. They're not even trying, Friedrich said beside him, voicing what Werner was thinking. This is just their normal life, and they're winning the war as a side effort. Over the following weeks, Werner settled into the routine of camp life. Wake at dawn, breakfast, truck ride to the farm, work all day, return to camp, dinner. Evening recreation. The prisoners could play cards, read books from the library, even watch occasional movies that the camp showed on a screen in the recreation hall. The movies were particularly instructive. They weren't propaganda films, which surprised Werner. They were regular American films, comedies, westerns, musicals. And in the background of every film, Werner saw the casual abundance of American life. Characters driving new cars, eating at restaurants with full plates, wearing clothes that looked new and clean, shopping at stores stocked with goods. One evening they showed a movie called Mrs. Miniver, which was about British civilians during the war. Even in that film, supposedly about hardship and sacrifice, the characters lived in comfortable homes, ate adequate food, maintained their dignity and routine. The contrast with German civilian life, which Werner knew from letters was growing desperate, was stark. Hans sat beside Werner during the movie. At one point, he leaned over and whispered, "Do you see now? Do you understand what I was trying to tell you?" "Yes," Werner replied, "I see it." After the movie, they walked back to the barracks under the electric lights that illuminated the camp paths. Werner asked Hans, "Did you know, before you were captured, did you know we would lose?" Hans stopped walking. Around them, other prisoners moved past, heading to their barracks. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but they were relaxed, routine. The war seemed very far away. "I knew the numbers," Hans said finally. "I saw the production reports, the intelligence assessments. By late 1942, I knew, but knowing the numbers and understanding what they mean are different things. I understood intellectually that America was outproducing us, but I couldn't understand what that actually meant until I came here and saw it." He gestured around the camp. All of this, the casual abundance, the waste. "Werner, they throw away more food in this camp each day than some German villages receive in a week. They discard tools that still work because newer ones are available. The guards' uniforms are replaced on a regular schedule, not because they're worn out, but just because. This is their normal. This is what we're fighting against." Werner looked up at the electric lights, thinking about Berlin, where power was rationed and blackouts were constant. "We can't win, can we?" "No," Hans said simply. "We never could. The only question now is how long it takes and how much more destruction happens before the end." The months passed. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. Werner and his fellow prisoners settled into their strange existence, captive yet comfortable, defeated yet well-fed. Letters from home arrived irregularly, censored but still carrying news. The news was never good. Werner received a letter from Anna in November 1943. The handwriting was his wife's, but the tone was different, strained. "My dear Werner, the children are well, though Heinrich asks about you constantly. We are managing. The rations have been reduced again, but we are managing. The apartment building 2 streets over was hit in a raid last week. The Schneiders lost everything. We were lucky our building was untouched. Maria draws pictures of you. She asks when you're coming home. I tell her soon, though I don't know if that's true. I tell her soon because I must tell her something. We are managing. Please know that we are managing. The word managing appeared 3 times. Werner understood what it meant. They were barely surviving, but Anna was trying to spare him the worst details. He sat on his bed, the letter in his hands, and looked around the barracks. Warm, clean, electric lights, his belly full from dinner. A Red Cross package on his shelf containing chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, luxuries his family in Berlin couldn't obtain at any price. The irony was crushing. He was a prisoner, and he was better off than his family at home. Friedrich came over, saw Werner's face. Letter from home? Yes, they're hungry, they're frightened, and I'm here eating fried chicken and apple pie. I know, Friedrich said quietly. I got a letter from my mother last week. Dresden. She says the bombing is getting worse. They spend every night in the cellar now. They sat in silence for a while. Then Friedrich said, Werner, I need to ask you something. What were we fighting for? I thought I knew. I thought we were defending the fatherland, protecting our families, fighting for Germany's rightful place. But now, I don't understand anymore. How did we end up here? How did everything go so wrong? Werner didn't answer immediately. It was a question he'd been wrestling with for months. Finally, he said, We believed lies, Friedrich. We believed our leaders who told us Germany was strong and our enemies were weak. We believed we had the right to take what we wanted because we were superior. We believed a lot of things that weren't true, and we never questioned them because questioning wasn't allowed. He paused. And now we're here, prisoners in a country that's beating us not with superior tactics or courage, but with something simpler and more powerful: abundance. They have more of everything, and they got it not through conquest, but through free people working together. We believed in the will to power. They believe in the power of productivity, and productivity is winning. Christmas 1943 came to Camp Shelby. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine branches and paper ornaments. The prisoners received Red Cross packages with special holiday contents: chocolate, cookies, even small cakes. The camp administration allowed them to hold a Christmas Eve service, with candles and singing. Werner stood with 200 other German prisoners, singing Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht in the quiet Mississippi night, and he wept. He wept for his family far away, for his country being destroyed, for all the death and waste and suffering that this war had brought. He wept for his own complicity in it, for all the times he'd cheered German victories without thinking about what they meant, for all the times he dismissed warnings because they were inconvenient. After the service, Klaus Zimmermann, the older sergeant who'd been at camp the longest, gathered a group of them together. I want to tell you something, Klaus said. Something I've been thinking about for months. We're going to lose this war. You all know it now. Germany is going to be defeated, occupied, probably divided. Our cities are being destroyed. Our people are starving. Everything we knew is ending. Several prisoners nodded, their faces somber. But, Klaus continued, we're going to survive. Most of us anyway. We're going to go home eventually. And when we do, we're going to have to rebuild, not just buildings, everything. Our country, our society, our way of thinking. And I want you to remember what you've seen here. Remember that a country can be strong without being cruel, that people can be productive without being enslaved, that abundance is possible without conquest. Remember that the Americans didn't win because they were more brutal than us. They won because they were more free. You sound like you admire them, someone said almost accusingly. I do, Klaus said without hesitation. I admire what they've built here. I admire that they can feed their enemies while fighting them. I admire that they follow rules even when it would be easier not to. Does that make me a traitor? Maybe. Or maybe it makes me someone who can learn from defeat. Werner thought about this conversation for days afterward. Learn from defeat. It was a concept foreign to German military tradition, which emphasized fighting to the last man, never surrendering, never acknowledging weakness. But perhaps that was exactly the problem. In January 1944, Werner was transferred to a new work detail, not farming this time, but helping to build a new road. The American engineers in charge of the project were civilians working for the War Department, and they brought an approach to work that fascinated Werner. They had blueprints, schedules, material lists. Everything was planned, calculated, efficient. When they encountered a problem, rock that needed to be removed, or unstable soil, they didn't just try to force through it. They stopped, reassessed, found the best solution, then proceeded. It was engineering, not just construction. The foreman, a man named Tom Cooper from Illinois, explained it one day during a break. You plan the work, then you work the plan. If the plan isn't working, you stop and make a new plan. No point in wasting time and materials doing something wrong. In Germany, we would just order workers to try harder, Werner said. Cooper laughed. Yeah, well, that's a good way to waste energy and get poor results. Better to think first, then work smart. Smart work, planned work, efficient work. Werner saw it everywhere now. The Americans weren't superhuman. They weren't even particularly gifted individually. But they had systems, processes, ways of working that multiplied their effectiveness. And they had so much equipment that when a tool broke, they just got another one. One day, a bulldozer broke down on the work site. Werner watched as Cooper made a phone call, and 3 hours later, a new bulldozer arrived on a flatbed truck, just like that. The broken one was loaded onto the truck to be taken away for repair, and work continued without significant delay. "How many bulldozers does America have?" Werner asked Cooper. "Thousands," Cooper said. "Hell, I don't know the exact number. A lot. We make 'em fast, use 'em hard, fix 'em or replace 'em, and keep going. That's how you build things efficiently." Werner tried to imagine Germany with thousands of bulldozers. He couldn't. Germany was lucky to have hundreds of tanks at this point, and those were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The scale difference wasn't just large, it was incomprehensible. Spring came to Mississippi in 1944, bringing warmth and green life back to the land. Werner had been a prisoner for almost a year now. He'd stopped thinking of himself as a Luftwaffe officer. That person seemed like someone from a different life. Now he was just Werner Schulz, prisoner 334,567, picking cotton and building roads and trying to understand how his world had been turned upside down. The news from Europe filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts that the Americans allowed them to hear. The Allies had landed in Italy. The bombing of German cities continued. The Eastern Front was collapsing. And in June, the invasion of France began. D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in history. Werner read the newspaper accounts of D-Day with a kind of detached professional interest. The numbers were staggering. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 troops in the first wave. The Americans and British had simply assembled an armada so large that nothing could stop it. Hans found him reading the paper in the camp library. "Impressive, isn't it?" Hans said. "It's overwhelming," Werner replied. 5,000 ships, Hans. Germany doesn't have 5,000 ships in our entire navy, and they built most of those for this single operation. "The mathematics were always clear," Hans said, sitting down. "I showed you the numbers a year ago. You didn't want to believe them." "I couldn't believe them," Werner corrected. "The numbers were too large to comprehend. Like telling someone about infinity, you can say the word, but you can't really understand it. But now, after seeing how Americans live, how they work, what they have, now I believe it. I see a farmer with 3 tractors and spare parts, and I understand how they can build 5,000 ships." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Werner asked, "What happens after Germany loses? What happens to us?" "We go home eventually," Hans said. "The war will end probably by late next year. We'll be repatriated. We'll return to whatever's left of Germany and try to rebuild our lives." "And what do we tell people?" Werner asked. "Do we tell them the truth, that we lost because we were outproduced, outsupplied, overwhelmed by an economy we couldn't match? Do we tell them that America won not through superior fighting, but through superior factories? Will anyone believe us?" "I don't know," Hans admitted, "but I think we have an obligation to try, because if Germans don't understand why we lost, we'll just make the same mistakes again." Summer 1944 brought more news of Allied advances. France was being liberated. The Red Army was pushing into Poland. The strategic bombing of Germany intensified. Werner received fewer letters from Anna now. The postal system was breaking down as Germany's infrastructure crumbled. One letter that did arrive in August was different in tone. "Werner, I must tell you something. The apartment was damaged in a raid. We are living with my sister now, all of us in one room. Food is scarce. The children are thin, but Werner, they are alive, and that is what matters. I don't care about the war anymore. I don't care who wins or loses. I just want my children to survive, and I want you to come home. Please somehow survive this and come home to us." Werner read this letter a dozen times. Anna didn't ask about victory. She didn't express hope for Germany's success. She just wanted survival. That was what it had come to. Simple survival was now the highest aspiration. He showed the letter to Friedrich, who had received similar news from his own family. "My mother says the Hitler Youth are being called up," Friedrich said. "Boys of 15 given rifles and told to defend Germany. 15-year-old boys against American tanks and aircraft." His voice broke. "What kind of leaders send children to fight? The kind who have run out of men," Werner said bitterly. "The kind who refuse to admit defeat even as everything collapses around them." That evening, Klaus Zimmermann called an informal meeting in one of the barracks. About 30 prisoners attended, all of them officers or senior NCOs, all of them thinking about what would come after the war. "Gentlemen," Klaus said, "I want to propose something. I want us to form a study group. We're going to be here for at least another year, maybe longer. Instead of just waiting, let's learn. Let's study how America works, their government, their economy, their systems. Let's try to understand how a democratic society can be so productive and so powerful. And when we go home, let's take that knowledge with us." "That sounds like collaboration," someone said. "Call it what you want," Klaus replied. "I call it education. We lost the war because we didn't understand our enemy. Let's not repeat that mistake by refusing to learn from them." Werner found himself nodding. Klaus is right. We owe it to the people we're going to serve after the war, assuming there's anything left to serve, to understand how to build a better society. One that doesn't lead to destruction. They started meeting twice a week. The Americans allowed it, even provided books from the library. They studied American history, civics, economics. They read the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, biographies of American leaders. They analyzed how American democracy worked, how the economy functioned, how free people could organize themselves without authoritarian control. It was educational in ways Werner hadn't anticipated. He'd been raised in a Germany that glorified the state, the leader, the collective will. The American system was different. It trusted individuals, limited government power, protected rights, valued commerce and innovation over conformity. "It's messy," Friedrich observed after one study session. "Americans argue constantly. They disagree about everything. How does anything get done?" "Yet things do get done," Hans pointed out. "They argue, they compromise, they move forward." And somehow, through all the arguing and disagreeing, they built the most productive economy in human history. Maybe the chaos is a feature, not a bug. Werner thought about this constantly. In Germany, efficiency had meant following orders without question. But here, efficiency meant something different. It meant freedom to innovate, to improve, to find better ways. The Americans had built their industrial might not through central planning and forced labor, but through millions of people freely choosing to work, to build, to create. It was a profound lesson, and one that Werner knew Germany would need to learn. Fall 1944 brought news that the end was approaching. Paris had been liberated. The Allies were pushing toward Germany itself. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, and everyone knew the outcome now. Werner received his last letter from Anna in October. It was brief, written on rough paper in pencil because ink was unavailable. "My dearest Werner, I don't know if this will reach you. The postal service barely functions. We are alive. We are together. We wait for the end, hoping it comes quickly and that we survive to see you again. I love you. The children love you. Come home to us. Anna." Werner held the letter carefully, this small piece of paper that had traveled across an ocean to reach him. It was probably the last word he would have from his family for months, maybe longer. He tucked it carefully in his pocket, close to his heart. Winter 1944-45 was the hardest time psychologically for the prisoners. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Germany was being destroyed. Cities were being reduced to rubble. The German military was collapsing. And they were here, safe and well-fed, unable to help, unable to even share in the suffering. "Survivor's guilt," Klaus called it. "We're alive and comfortable while our families and countrymen suffer and die. It's not rational to feel guilty about it, but we do anyway." Christmas 1944 came, their second in captivity. The Americans again allowed them to celebrate, even providing a small tree for the barracks. Werner and his fellow prisoners sang carols and tried to find some meaning in the season. "Peace on earth," the songs said. "Goodwill toward men." It seemed like a hollow promise while war still raged. But on that Christmas Eve, Werner made a resolution. He would survive, he would go home, and he would use what he'd learned here to help rebuild Germany into something better, something that would never again lead to such destruction. The winter passed slowly. News from Europe was sporadic but consistently grim for Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last offensive, failed. The Rhine was crossed. Berlin was surrounded. And in April 1945, the news came. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The day the surrender was announced, Camp Shelby fell into a strange silence. The American guards didn't celebrate loudly. Many had friends or family still fighting in the Pacific. The German prisoners were quiet, processing the news. Werner sat on his bed, trying to feel something. Relief, grief, shame. He felt all of those things and none of them. Mostly he felt tired. Tired of war, tired of ideology, tired of everything that had led to this moment. "It's over," Friedrich said, sitting beside him. "We lost." "Yes," Werner agreed. "We lost. Germany is destroyed. Millions are dead. Our cities are ruins. Everything we knew is gone." Was it worth it? Friedrich asked. Any of it? No, Werner said without hesitation. None of it was worth it. Every life lost, every building destroyed, every family torn apart, none of it should have happened. We were led by madmen into a catastrophe, and we followed because we didn't question, didn't think, didn't resist. Hans joined them, looking tired but somehow lighter, as if a weight had lifted. I've been thinking about what Klaus said months ago, about learning from defeat. I think he was right. This defeat, as terrible as it is, might be the best thing that could have happened to Germany. How can you say that? Friedrich asked. Because we needed to be stopped, Hans said simply. Germany was on a path to destruction, taking the world with it. We couldn't stop ourselves, so we had to be stopped. And now perhaps we can start again, build something better. They sat together as the day faded into evening, 3 German prisoners in Mississippi, contemplating the ruins of their country and the possibility of its redemption. The months after the surrender were strange. Prisoners remained in camp. There was nowhere to send them yet. Germany was occupied, divided, chaotic. Repatriation would take time to organize, but something changed in the camp. The prisoners were no longer enemy combatants. They were just displaced persons waiting to go home. The tension eased. The Americans relaxed restrictions. The work continued. Farms still needed workers. Roads still needed building, but it felt different now. Werner continued his work detail at Harrison's farm. One day in June, Harrison's son came home from the war. His name was Robert, and he'd been a tank commander in France and Germany. He'd seen the destruction, the concentration camps, the horror of what had been done in Germany's name. Robert came to the farm on a Saturday, still in his uniform, and Werner was there working. They saw each other across the cotton field, these 2 men who might have killed each other in different circumstances. Harrison called them both over to the farmhouse. Robert, this is Werner. He's been working here for over a year now, fixed our truck once. Good worker. Werner, this is my son. Werner extended his hand. I'm glad you made it home safely. Robert looked at the hand for a moment, then took it. Thanks, I'm glad the war's over. They shook hands, these former enemies, and something important happened in that moment. Not forgiveness, exactly, that would take much longer, but recognition, acknowledgement, the beginning of something new. Over lunch, Robert talked about what he'd seen in Germany. The destruction is complete, he said. Cities just gone, millions of displaced people wandering around, no food, no shelter, no organization. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. That's my country you're describing, Werner said quietly. My family is somewhere in that chaos. I know, Robert said. I'm not trying to make you feel worse. I'm just telling you what it's like. You need to know what you're going home to. I appreciate the honesty, Werner said. Better to know than to hope for something that's not there. Harrison Sr. spoke up. The way I see it, you've both got jobs ahead of you. Robert, you've got to come home and remember how to be a civilian again. Werner, you've got to go home and help rebuild your country. Neither of those is going to be easy. No, sir, they both said in unison, then smiled at the coincidence. It was a small moment, but significant. The war was ending not with continued hatred, but with the hard work of reconciliation beginning. Autumn 1945 brought the first news of repatriation. Prisoners would begin returning to Germany in organized groups, processed through camps in Europe before final release. Werner's group was scheduled for transport in December. He spent his last weeks in America trying to memorize everything he'd learned. The abundance, the efficiency, the systems, the democracy. Filled notebooks with observations, knowing that many Germans wouldn't believe him without details. Klaus and Hans and Friedrich and Werner spent their final days together talking about the future. We're going to face skepticism, Klaus said. People are going to accuse us of being brainwashed, of becoming American sympathizers. Let them, Werner said. We know the truth, we've seen what works, and Germany is going to need people who understand how to build a democratic, productive society. If they'll listen, Friedrich added. They'll listen eventually, Hans said. When you're starving and homeless, you become willing to try new ideas. Germany is going to be desperate for years. Desperate people are teachable people. December 1945. Werner Schulz stood in the processing center at Camp Shelby one last time, waiting to board the bus that would take his group to the port. He was wearing the same German uniform he'd arrived in, cleaned and repaired, marked with PW on the back. Sergeant Patterson, who'd processed him in almost 2.5 years earlier, was processing him out now. Good luck, Captain Schulz, Patterson said, stamping the final forms. Thank you, Sergeant, Werner replied, for everything. You treated us fairly. Just following the rules, Patterson said, but he seemed pleased. Many people don't follow rules when they don't have to, Werner said. You did, that's worth recognizing. The bus arrived. Werner climbed aboard with dozens of other prisoners, all of them heading home at last. As the bus pulled away from Camp Shelby, Werner looked back at the camp one final time. This place where he'd spent over 2 years as a prisoner. This place that had taught him more than he could have imagined. The journey home took weeks. By ship to France, then by train across France and into occupied Germany. At every stage, Werner saw the vast machinery of American logistics, the camps, the supplies, the organization. Even in peace, America's productive capacity was overwhelming. Finally, in January 1946, Werner crossed into the Soviet occupation zone where Berlin was located. The change was immediate and stark. He'd spent over 2 years in American abundance, and now he returned to German devastation. Berlin was worse than he'd imagined. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. People living in cellars and makeshift shelters. Food scarce, utilities barely functioning, disease widespread. It looked like the end of civilization. Werner found his family in his sister-in-law's apartment in a building that had somehow survived mostly intact. Anna had lost weight, her face lined with hardship. Heinrich was 10 now, thin and serious beyond his years. Maria was 7, shy and fearful. They fell into each other's arms, and Werner wept as he held his wife and children for the first time in nearly 3 years. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. That night, huddled together in one small room with a small stove for heat, Anna asked him about his time as a prisoner. Werner didn't know how to explain. How could he tell her that he'd been better fed as a prisoner than she'd been as a free citizen? How could he describe the abundance he'd witnessed while she'd been starving? It was educational, he finally said. I learned things that will help us rebuild. What kinds of things? Anna asked. How to build a better Germany, Werner said. One that doesn't lead to this. He gestured at the window at the ruins visible outside. Over the following weeks, Werner tried to find work, tried to help his family survive. Berlin was divided among the 4 occupying powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, and conditions varied significantly by sector. In the American sector, things were better. Food distribution was more reliable. Reconstruction was more organized. The Americans brought the same systematic efficiency they'd applied to the work of occupation and rebuilding. Werner volunteered to work on reconstruction projects in the American sector, using the skills and knowledge he'd gained. He noticed that the American overseers used similar methods to what he'd seen at Camp Shelby: planning, efficiency, good tools, adequate supplies. One day, he was working on clearing rubble when an American civilian administrator named Morrison came by to inspect progress. You speak English, Morrison noted, hearing Werner translate instructions for other workers. I learned it as a prisoner in America, Werner said. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Morrison's eyebrows rose. You were a POW, what did you do there? Farm work mostly, cotton picking, road building, standard Geneva Convention labor. What did you think of America? Werner paused in his work, considering the question. I thought your country was rich beyond measure. I thought you were wasteful. I thought you were disorganized because you argued about everything. He smiled slightly. Then I realized that your wealth came from freedom and productivity, your waste was actually surplus capacity, and your arguments were how free people solve problems. I learned more as your prisoner than I had in years as a German officer. Morrison studied him for a moment. Germany's going to need people like you, people who can understand how democracy and free markets work. There aren't many of those left here. There are more than you think, Werner said. We just need time to find each other and permission to speak freely. Morrison nodded. Well, keep up the good work. If you're interested, we're going to need translators and liaisons, people who understand both German and American culture. Think about it. That conversation led to opportunities. Within months, Werner was working as a translator and cultural liaison for the American military government. It wasn't much pay, but it was steady work, and it put him in position to help shape reconstruction efforts. He reunited with Hans and Friedrich, both of whom had also made it home. Klaus had settled in the western zones, working with the British occupation authorities. The network they'd begun at Camp Shelby continued, a loose association of former prisoners who'd learned from their captivity and wanted to apply those lessons. They weren't the only ones. Across Germany, people were rethinking everything. The Nazi ideology had led to catastrophe. The old Prussian militarism had failed. Something new was needed. Now, back to where we started. 3 years after Werner's return to Germany, in early 1949, he stood in a small office in the American sector of Berlin. Representatives from the Western Allies were working on establishing a new German government in their zones, what would become the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Werner had been invited to consult on the new constitution being drafted. His experiences as a prisoner, his understanding of American democracy, his ability to translate not just language but concepts between cultures, All of this made him valuable to the process. A young American diplomat named Richardson was reviewing draft articles when Werner arrived. "Captain Schulz," Richardson said. "Or should I say Herr Schulz now?" "Just Werner is fine," he replied. "We're trying to leave the military ranks behind." "Fair enough." "Werner, I wanted your opinion on something. We're debating how strong to make the federal government versus the states. The German representatives are used to strong central authority. We Americans are nervous about that, given recent history. But we also don't want the new Germany to be too weak to function. What do you think?" Werner sat down, thinking about all he'd learned. "Strong enough to provide services and security," he said. "Weak enough that it can't threaten freedom. With checks and balances at every level. Power shared among multiple institutions so no one can accumulate too much. And always accountable to the people through free elections." "That's basically the American system," Richardson noted. "Yes," Werner agreed. "Because it works. I saw it work. Not perfectly, no system is perfect, but it works well enough that the people are prosperous and free. That's what Germany needs now. Not perfection, but a system that works well enough to give people hope and opportunity." Richardson smiled. "You know, most German officers we captured spent their time in POW camps bitter and resentful. You spent yours learning. That's unusual." "I had good teachers," Werner said. "A farmer in Mississippi who showed me that free people work harder than slaves. An American foreman who taught me that planning is more effective than just demanding effort. A camp librarian who helped me understand that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest. And my fellow prisoners who helped me see that defeat could be educational rather than just tragic. Well, Germany is lucky to have you helping with Reconstruction. Germany is lucky to have survived it all," Werner said quietly. "We came very close to destroying ourselves completely. The fact that we're here rebuilding, working toward democracy and peace, that's not luck. That's mercy. Mercy from the Americans and British and French who could have treated us far worse than they have. We owe it to them and to our own children to build something better this time." Over the following months and years, Werner watched the Federal Republic of Germany take shape. It wasn't perfect. There were compromises, arguments, setbacks. But it was democratic, federal, constitutional, based on human rights and the rule of law. It was everything the Third Reich hadn't been. The economic recovery, when it came, was remarkable. The Marshall Plan brought American aid money, materials, expertise. German industry, rebuilt with modern equipment and organized along efficient lines, became productive again. The economic miracle of the 1950s wasn't really a miracle. It was what happened when free people with good tools and adequate capital worked together productively. Werner saw the patterns he'd observed at Camp Shelby replicated across West Germany. Farms with tractors and spare parts, factories with good equipment and systematic processes. Workers paid fair wages who could then buy products from other workers. A virtuous cycle of production and consumption, just like in America. By the late 1950s, West Germany was prosperous again. Not as wealthy as America, few countries were, but comfortable, stable, democratic. The ruins of Berlin were being rebuilt. People had enough to eat, decent housing, jobs, hope for the future. Werner's children grew up in this new Germany. Heinrich became an engineer, using modern techniques to build bridges and roads. Maria became a teacher, educating a new generation about democracy and human rights. Neither of them had personal memory of the war, they'd been too young. But they learned from their father about the importance of freedom, democracy, and never again letting extremism take root. One day in 1963, Werner received a letter from America. It was from Robert Harrison, the farmer's son he'd met briefly in Mississippi. Robert had taken over his father's farm after his father retired, and he wrote about his life, his family, the farm's continued prosperity. The letter included a newspaper clipping about German-American friendship, about how former enemies had become allies in the Cold War. And Robert wrote, "I think about that day we met sometimes, you and me, two soldiers who'd been trying to kill each other just months before. My dad was right, we both had jobs to do after the war. You had to help rebuild Germany. I had to come home and build a life. Looks like we both succeeded. Maybe that's how you really win a war, not by destroying your enemy, but by helping them become friends afterward." Werner wrote back, agreeing. The real victory wasn't in 1945 when Germany surrendered. The real victory was in the years after, when former enemies chose to build rather than destroy, to cooperate rather than compete, to learn from each other rather than hate. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, Werner Schulz was invited to speak at a conference in Munich about reconciliation and reconstruction. He was 70 now, retired, a grandfather. Most of the war generation was gone or fading. The young people in the audience had no memory of the war at all. Werner told them his story, about being a proud German pilot who believed in victory, about being shot down and captured, about arriving at Camp Shelby and slowly, gradually realizing that everything he'd believed was wrong, about learning from his captors, about coming home to ruins and helping rebuild into something better. The lesson I learned, Werner concluded, is that strength comes from freedom, not force, that prosperity comes from productivity, not plunder, that democracy, for all its messiness and arguing, is more effective than dictatorship, and that former enemies can become friends if they choose to. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. Herr Schulz, do you think Germany would have learned these lessons without being defeated? Werner considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. We were too proud, too convinced of our superiority, too unwilling to listen to reason. We needed to be defeated decisively and completely before we could learn. It's a harsh way to learn, and millions of people died in the process. But yes, I think the defeat was necessary, not as punishment but as education. Do you regret fighting for Germany? I regret that I fought for the wrong Germany, Werner said. I fought for a Germany of conquest and hatred and supremacy. I wish I had fought instead for a Germany of freedom and democracy and human dignity. But I couldn't fight for that Germany until it existed, and it couldn't exist until the old Germany was destroyed. So no, I don't regret my service, but I'm profoundly grateful that we lost. After the conference, Hans Bergman found Werner. Hans was 72 now, a retired economics professor who'd spent his career studying how West Germany's economic recovery happened. Good speech, Hans said. You've become quite the philosopher in your old age. We all have, Werner replied. Living through that kind of catastrophe and rebuilding afterward, it makes you think deeply about things. They walked together through Munich's streets, this city that had been the birthplace of Nazism and was now a prosperous, democratic metropolis. The scars of war were gone, covered over by new buildings and new generations. Do you think the lessons will last? Hans asked. Or will people forget? Some will forget, Werner said. That's inevitable, memory fades, but the structures we built, the democracy, the Constitution, the integration with Europe and America, those are designed to prevent forgetting. As long as those structures hold, the lessons are preserved in them. I hope you're right, Hans said, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. They stood for a moment in silence, two old men who'd witnessed the worst and helped build something better, hoping that their work would endure. Werner Schulz died in 1991 at the age of 76, just months after the reunification of Germany. He lived long enough to see the Cold War end, the Berlin Wall fall, and Germany whole again, not through conquest this time, but through peaceful negotiation and democratic choice. At his funeral, his son Heinrich spoke about his father's life, about the young pilot who'd believed in the wrong cause, about the prisoner who'd learned humility, about the translator and liaison who'd helped rebuild, about the grandfather who taught his grandchildren that strength comes from freedom and that former enemies can become friends. My father's generation, Heinrich said, lived through Germany's greatest catastrophe and helped build its greatest success. They learned from defeat and taught us those lessons. We owe them our gratitude, and we owe it to them to remember what they learned at such terrible cost. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.